Welcome to Village Church. We're committed to seeing people transformed into fully devoted followers of Jesus. We do this through focusing on gospel, community, and culture. Learn more about us at thisisvillagechurch.com.
Well, good morning, Village Church. My name is Victor. If you don't know me, I'm the lead pastor here at the Surrey location. Great to be with you. A special welcome if you are new. Thanks, Tom. A special welcome if you're new. This is your first time being exposed to church. We are people of the book here. We love to open the book, the Bible, and find the words of Jesus. We believe here that they actually transform and change us, not only corporately as a church, but individually, personally, that Jesus is found in these words. So we love to open this text with anticipation that we can hear from God each and every week. And if you are new, we actually have Bibles on your way in. If you missed that, then that's life. That was your window. And you can get one on the way out, but we also have it here for you because we're so kind. But let's open this thing up. We're going to go in verse 11. We're going to spend a lot of time probably in this first verse here. There's so much here. And this first word, therefore, is a common one. If you've been here long enough, you know what this means. It's kind of a link word in light of everything Paul just said, everything he articulated, explained, taught. Therefore, do this, believe this, think this, act this way. So what did Paul just say? Well, Pastor Fanu did an incredible job last week explaining that. Let's get to the nuts and bolts just quickly. That verse that I think summarizes that therefore in verse 9. It says, so whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. Talking about Jesus. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in body, whether good or evil. And about 10 years ago, I did my master's at Northwest Baptist Seminary. It was an incredible experience. If you actually have a full-time ministry kind of itch and you're thinking, man, I want to take that next step, I want to be equipped, be trained, we highly encourage going to seminary. We're so bought into this idea, actually, at Village Church, is that we offer something in-house called Immerse. We partnered with Northwest Baptist Seminary, and we offer two different master's degrees. One is a Master's of Divinity, it's a 3-year, and one is an MA, I think, Biblical Leadership, it's a 2-year, and it's completely in-house. We have 5 students currently across Canada, a bunch of our sites, doing this right now currently, being prepared, equipped to be incredible pastors for the future. But that wasn't really my experience. When I did it 10 years ago, I was cocky, arrogant, young, and I thought I can do a 2.5, almost 3-year program in about just over a year. And so I said goodbye to my wife, and I just said, I'm going to hide under a rock, and I'm going to get this thing done as fast as I can. I didn't have the big picture in mind. I did not pace myself. I didn't have the long game. I started strong, but we were in this dingy basement suite for the first couple years of our marriage. And I remember it just went south quick. Within a year in, I just had no rhythms, no balance, no healthy things in my life. There was moments where my wife would go off to work for the day and I'd be at the desk, grinding out a paper or researching whatever. And she'd come home and literally I'd be in the same spot at my desk, just she comes home and she's like, oh my goodness. I'm like, hey, baby. It was just not a great experience for us. I just didn't have the long game in mind when I committed to something that big. And I think not just seminary, but just us in life. I think this is what Paul's trying to hit in verse 9, that therefore statement. He's saying you got to have the big picture in mind in all this. You got to have the long game in mind to pace yourself. The reality is God will judge everything one day. And that frames our life differently. It naturally produces what they call the fear of the Lord in us. Everything then has weight. Your relationships have weight. Your choices you make every day have weight. Your marriage, how you do work, how you go about your business, how you manage your finances, all of those are weight. They're not trivial things just about life onto you and how they serve you. They have an eternal impact. They're measurable. They're weighty in your life. That does something. It's a proper perspective on how you should run your life. And that's This word is a fairly loaded word, one we tend to shy away from, if we're honest. We like words like God's kindness, his love, his goodness, his mercy, his forgiveness. But the fear of the Lord, it feels like this awkward kind of puzzle piece that we don't know what to do with, and we just kind of move to the side. We got a good enough picture of God. I don't think we actually need it. It feels Old Testament, if we're honest. It feels like wrath of God, kind of Mount Sinai, the earth shaking, splitting open, people falling over under the fear of the Lord. But the New Testament, the Jesus thing, it's like he's a good shepherd. He hangs out with his sheep. He talks about the birds of the air and the lilies of the ground, and he draws children onto him. Jesus seems to be much more low-key in the New Testament. But you look at texts like Ephesians 5:21, treat each other right in church out of fear of Christ. So much so in Revelation 1:17, John has this encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And this is his response: when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. That doesn't seem very low-key. That we see the expression of the fear of the Lord through the Old and New Testament. The expectation for all of us. And Paul doesn't only frame it as a driver for him, for the mission that Jesus has given him, but a critical component in his relationship with God, how he views God. A couple weeks ago, we saw a baptism video. There's about 60 people that got baptized down in the cold. There's no winter ocean water is freezing. I had 4 different thermal suits on, baptizing people. It's very village-esque to do that in the winter. And we had about 60 people getting baptized. It's incredible. I brought my kids. Kristen came with the kids, and we were right down the water. And my kids, being kids, it's the middle of fall, and they are in the water within seconds. I turn around, and they're like, oh, they're splashing around, and we're pulling them back. And then I look back again, they're literally, boots are full of water, mud in their hands. And I'm like, we're trying to have a baptism here. And I'm wrangling kids while someone's crying after they just got baptized. But there's something about my kids, and maybe yours as well, that they just rush towards the ocean. I'm always having to rein them back. They just go. They don't care. They don't think about the dangers of the ocean. They have a one-dimensional relationship with the ocean. They see it as fun, which is true. Many of us, we see the ocean as fun. It's almost therapeutic to sit by the water and see the waves roll in. There's something healing. There's something restful that happens. And that my own time when I connect with God is often by the ocean, when I'm praying, when I'm thinking, when I'm contemplating. So much so, one poet says, waves hitting the shore is like the world catching its breath over and over again. It's almost like we are doing the same as we just sit by the ocean and reflect and take a breath and slow down. It does something profound in our lives. But there's also a real reason why the ocean floor is coated with shipwrecks and debris, because man's best efforts to conquer the seas fall short over and over again throughout history. The furious power of the ocean is untamed and one to have reverence for. That's the full picture of how we relate to the ocean, the same way with our God. That word fear, phobos, isn't one necessarily of a tyrannical terror. It's not that we're always in a posture of ready to be smite, ready to be taken out, that we're constantly afraid of God. That's not really the point of that word. It's to have a deep reverence for the one that you're relating to. It's to be in reverence of the one that you're talking to, not wanting to misspeak to a president or not wanting to misrepresent yourself to someone who is famous, or eagerly not wanting to misrepresent or letting a lieutenant down in the army. It's the idea of counting your steps, watching your posture, and being slow to speak, having reverence. And here's the reality is, over the years, I'm convinced personally and pastorally in my experiences that you will not be successful as a disciple of Jesus without the fear of the Lord intertwined into your being, without having a reverence for God. If you take out that puzzle piece and just throw it to the side, you don't have the full picture. Just like my kids in the ocean just rushing in, they don't have the full picture of what the ocean is and how to relate to it. And because here's why. Here's what I think the fear of the Lord does in us. Is it produces this beautiful resilience, this resistance to sin. It's this gracious safeguard in our lives that God has placed there. And it's an engine that propels us towards holiness, the call that all of us are called to do, to be like Jesus, to be holy and set apart. The fear of the Lord gets us there. It actually guards us from misstepping if we're tempted. Like, think about this. If your only driver for not cheating on your spouse is you don't want to hurt them and that you love them so much, what happens when those things get a bit shaken up? What happens when your marriage is a bit stale and it's been like that for months? You're not intimate, you're not connecting, you're kind of talking through each other. You're not connecting, and then you go on that work trip, the classic work trip, where you go and that that work friend is starting to give you attention, it's starting to lean into you, and it feels good, it feels familiar, something you used to have with your wife, and you like that feeling. What safeguards do you have in place? If your only defense is a wife that won't find out and a God who's only loving and merciful, then what do you have? What about if you're in a business and you have the opportunity in your role to shift some accounts around and make maybe a bit of a side hustle for yourself? But the only motivator to prevent you from doing that is that you want to be loyal to the company, you feel like you have a high ceiling in the company, the boss sees you in the right way. What happens when the boss hires someone above you and you get cut out of certain meetings? Like the drivers for not doing sin, not committing to certain compromises are gone without the fear of the Lord in place. For some of you, in varying levels, there's some of you that struggle with pornography. Some of you are dabbling in it. Some of you have a full-blown addiction to it. And it's complicated, of course. There's multi-layers to this. God is faithful to you? Absolutely. He's forgiving on the other side of the mistake? Absolutely. And some of you just need to hear that. But there's some of you, not all, there's some of you who've been around the circuit forever. You've been in the accountability groups, you've done the programs, you show up to the friends, you say, I screwed up again, and then you're back at it, and you screw up again, and you're in this vicious cycle, and you feel like you have no momentum, no movement forward in your faith. And for some of you, what you need to hear, and what the problem is perhaps you're just not taking God seriously enough. Like there's no reverence for a God that gives you breath the moment you pick up that phone or you open that laptop. And that you need to actually build out a fear of the Lord in you. Look, the goal isn't to frame God as someone who's cold and this distant king to have a healthy distance from. That's actually the misconception of all this. That we see this thing of intimacy as the closeness of God is when he's merciful and forgiving and kind. And the fear of the Lord, that the fear is to be distant and far from it. That's not true. Look at Psalms 37. Who does the Lord encamp around? Those who fear him. Matthew 5. Who are those who get to see God? The pure of heart. Those who chase after holiness. Increased fear of God in your life is increased closeness to God. To pray, God, I want to fear you more, is to invite him in and say, be closer to me. That's the call. And what is this all onto? Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others. In light of knowing something that produces something in us, it dictates how we live and act in our lives. To persuade others, to share the gospel, the good news that resides in all of us to people in our life that are closest to us in our community, something that we've been increasingly reluctant to do through the data, throughout history that shows that this is massively on the decline. That evangelism seems to be dying, but it's not actually dying. Evangelism isn't dead. It's simply been handed over to the secular prophet that's proclaiming a different gospel in the streets. One that probably resonates with you. You've heard, you felt the reluctancy to share anything because you felt the gospel preached at you. One that says your faith might be subjectively meaningful, good for you, but it's objectively untrue and potentially harmful, so keep it to yourself. That's a gospel I know many of you have felt and heard. We have been evangelized that evangelism is wrong. And many of us have been converted. What Barna Group, especially for young people, Barna Group states that almost half of our practicing Christians, millennial Christians, see evangelism as wrong. And part of me gets it. Like, the times have definitely changed. When I was younger, I'm not old, but I'm also not young. I remember there is a different climate when I was a teenager and when I was younger. And I remember watching a lot of videos or movies, like more Hallmarky Christian movies, around like young teenagers just struggling with temptation in high school. They're new to the community. They go to this new high school. And there's always there's this kid named Bobby. Bobby's like the main character. He's like the one Christian in his high school, and he's trying to be strong and follow Jesus. And there's always the non-Christian. And they always like make this caricature of him. He usually has like a leather jacket, the pop collar, and he's smoking. He's like pure evil. He's like just smoking. And he's tempting Bobby, and he uses lines like, it'd be like, Bobby, we're gonna do serious drugs after school. You gonna join us, or you're too cool going to your church? Or, Bobby, we're gonna go graffiti by the tracks. You coming with us, or you love your Jesus, you little baby? And Bobby's struggling. He's struggling with all the temptation of, man, I want to be cool and fit in, but I want to follow Jesus, and this is a real struggle, and we related to these videos. That was the challenge of evangelizing and being a disciple when I grew up, was just being uncool. It was Christianity in general was lame. It was morally good. We all agreed that, but it was just lame. Rebels were the cool one. But the times have drastically changed. Now, when you share the gospel, now when you evangelize, you aren't seen as annoyingly moral. You're seen as evil. Now, you're the person that hates certain minorities, judgmental, narrow, anti-everything, conservative, capitalist, whatever it is, you name it. You attend those abusive church services. You're not what's good with the world, you're what's wrong with it. That's the current climate. The danger of evangelizing when I was growing up was just being uncool. Now it's being hated. Stakes are higher. But the call is not to get silent. Primarily, firstly, because the cultural gospel is a massive contradiction. My friend Chris Price, a pastor in Vancouver, says, what the gospel will say to you is, you shouldn't evangelize to people based on your religious viewpoint. You are at that very moment evangelizing based on your religious viewpoint. You shouldn't impose your beliefs on others, but that is a belief you're trying to impose on me. And so there's massive holes in the narrative that we can push up against eagerly and with confidence of what the waters are out there. But more importantly, secondly, is regardless of what the current climate is, the call is the same. The challenge is the same. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much we get pushed against, Jesus said his response to us is, hey, they hated me first. You're in good company. Whether that's in the thick of World War II Germany, underground churches in China, or right here in the 21st century of Canada, the church is called to persuade others. Not brash, but courageous. Not tolerant, but winsome. Not us versus them, but us for them. This isn't about throwing blanket statements on Facebook. It's about laboring over how to effectively reach people in proximity to you in the current climate. That's the call. And going back to the words of Paul, that root word of persuade is almost synonymous with the Greco-Roman of a rhetoric tradition. All throughout the letters of Corinth, Paul is hammering both sides, diligently debating, teaching, persuading, convincing, explaining, using any tact he possibly can to win people over to the gospel. It says he went to the synagogue on Sabbath every week just to labor to convince anyone who would have ear to the gospel. He did the work, but he also rejected the idea that his abilities had any transformative work. Look what he says in 1 Corinthians 2. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. You know what I'm doing up here. There's a science to this, right? Like there's an art, there's a craft to preaching. Like not only in the preparation, we're thinking of how do we exegetically expand this so it makes sense. We bring in historical voices to bring weight to this conversation, but we also think of our audience. We think of you. We think of the diversity of this room, those who are watching online. We think of different genders in this room, different ages, different stages of life, different ethnicities, those who are de-churched, those who are skeptic, those who have been at church for a long time. How do we be inclusive in how we communicate to all those type of people? But we also think of in our preparation of how to bring in tensions. If I show my cards all over the front, you stepped out. You've opted out of this conversation. If you create tension in the craft of preaching, you're engaged. We bring in stories to expand ideas. We bring in humor to give you reprieve. If I'm hammering things all the time, you just step back. It's just too exhausting. But not only that, in the actual delivery, where I stand on stage matters. It says something. Who I address in the room matters. Everything has a purpose. From like my even cadence, when I intentionally slow down to make a point about nothing. It has weight. Volume control, I'll get loud, I'll slam this because it seems authoritative. We do certain things. You open hand when I'm talking. You don't close hand. You don't never point fingers too aggressive. All these things. I'm looking at the online people because I got to engage the camera. I got to make sure our timer's on time. 14 minutes now, over 35 minutes. Everything has to be done right. There's a craft to this, and I love it. And we want to continue to be better at it, to engage you with the most vibrant message in the universe, the gospel. But my worry is that you go for lunch and you talk over the message and you say, that was a great message, and you can't actually articulate why. And it's probably because of these things I just said. The story was funny or the joke landed. And it's not necessarily because of something profound that God did in your life in that very moment. The question is, when you walk through those doors every week, do you actually anticipate that God will speak to you through as we open this text? Are you eagerly anticipating that he has something for you right now in this moment? And the more brash but honest question is, do you even care? Do you want to hear from God, or is church just a regular Sunday thing for you? Stories will be forgotten. Jokes that land will probably get me canceled in like 5 years. The craft washes away, and all that remains, the hope is all that remains is the Spirit drawing you in this very moment to do a transformative work in your life. That the only thing that's going to hold up in your life, that's going to sustain you, is not the ability to preach when you're going through pain, exciting new opportunities, empty nesting, bankruptcy, career changes. It's that Jesus deposits something in you that sustains you for the rest of your life. And here's why I think this speaks to all of us, not just the preacher and the congregation, but all of us as we engage with the mission of Jesus. We're moving on. This is what it says. But what we are is known to God. And I hope it is known also to your conscience. Oops. We are not commending ourselves to you again, but giving you cause to boast about us, so that you may be able to answer those who boast about outward appearances and not about the heart. Okay, who's the elephant in the room? Who is he talking about boasting about outward appearances? Who's he actually addressing? He's addressing the sophists, these guys, who would be well-known, revered speakers all across the Greco-Roman world. These guys would be lavish in their reputation, in their clothing, in their appearances. They cared a lot about how people thought of them. They were excellent communicators. But they focused on their reputation, the exterior life, the outward appearances. How much does that relate to us? How much do you feel that? How much do I feel that? That what is in my external world is the most important thing. Having no way of just articulating what's happening internally. Not even just giving attention to it, but you don't even know what's churning on the inside of you because you've drawn so much attention to the outside. These two begin to be disconnected, the external life, our internal life, outward appearances, and what Paul calls the heart. Some of you teenagers, you can't even look your parents in the eye. Because the things that you know you're supposed to be doing, you're a good kid, you're trying to make them happy, you're going to youth group, you show up at church, but the things that actually are turning inside of your heart, the things around your identity, doubts, purpose, all this stuff, you have no idea how to even bring that up to your parents. The disconnect, your marriages. Some of you, your marriages, the way you talk to each other is one-dimensional. You ask questions like, how are you doing? But it's surface level. You wouldn't dare go down to those deeper layers of how you're actually doing, where sin probably resides, to bring those things up. You just can't bring those things onto the table for discussion. There's no depth to the way you talk to. There's this disconnect between what's happening here and what's actually being presented here. And that's exhausting to live that way. And personally speaking, confession is the ultimate recalibrator of the internal and the external in your life. The things I've had to confess to my parents, to friends, to my wife is game-changing, absolute healing. As one author says, God who examines our souls, our hearts, with a jeweler's eye, knows the deepest parts of you. He can articulate what's going on here more than you can. And one of the best things you can do is bring it to light in confession. Verse 13 says, for if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. He's talking about these spiritual experiences. If we are in our right mind, it is for you, for the love of Christ controls us. Paul has had some trippy experiences, some visions all throughout Acts and some in 1 Corinthians. He says he speaks in tongues more than any other person. In chapter 14, 18, he's had some serious spiritual experiences that are really meaningful to him, that have actually really been a part of his identity and would probably actually impress the Corinthians and win them over. But he puts that on the back burner so that they won't see him and how impressive he is, but he'll see the love of Jesus in him. Why? What trumps Paul's need to be liked, celebrated, esteemed, leverage his experiences, guard his reputation, is a deep concern for love for other people. On the outside, they look the same, the sophist and Paul. But in the heart, the sophists are driven by self, their own reputation, and Paul is driven by others and love for others. So much so, it says Paul says the love of Jesus controls him. Other translations, leaves him no choice, constrains him. As one author says, Christ's self-sacrificing love restrains Paul from self-seeking. The constraints Jesus' love provides us is the most freeing thing. There's this experiment done by American Society of Landscape Architects. So pretty much guys who build playgrounds. This experiment with a group of kids. And the first playground they let the kids play on, same group of kids, they had no boundaries, no fences, no nothing. It was just field all around, beautiful playground. And they noticed in this experiment, the kids stayed very close to the teacher. They didn't play independently, and they didn't explore all the areas of the playground. And they reported they didn't feel very safe in that environment. Exact same group of kids went to another playground that had fences and gates around it, and those kids explored every nook and cranny of the playground, stayed very independent from the teacher, and felt safe in their playtime. Paul was freed up to have a clear boundary of God's love and mission for his people, in which his whole self, internal and external, was moving towards. That he was integral, whole, genuine in his approach. There's immense freedom in that. for everything, your whole being to be lined up for one thing, the mission and love of Jesus. Comparatively, the sophists who had no framework, which sounds freeing, but were imprisoned by applause, dressed lavishly to feel seen, respected, and liked, and communicated whatever was compelling to people. They were known for not having much virtue, to keep the attention on them at all costs. And what about you? The common thing, how many of our decisions in our day are driven by a need to be liked, respected, esteemed, accepted? And Paul's life, I think what he models here, forces us into a corner and asks us the question of, do you want to be known at the end of all of this, at your funeral? Do you want to be known as impressive, or a life that was loving? And obviously, you're probably all going to say loving because it feels like the right answer. But in order to do this has to die as a primary driver for our lives. But it can't. And either could it for Paul. We are slaves to our reputation, our image, our need to be better than others, imprisoned by applause, to serve self, unless this is true. Because we have concluded this. We've been convinced of this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. In short, what Paul is saying is Christ's death was the death of all. He paid the full price for your sin, that you may no longer live for yourself, but for him. That's the whole point of this, is death to self, to draw us to the cross as well, putting to death all our misguided longings, selfish pursuits, desires, sense of worth, reputation, value, of being driven by something and someone else, controlled and compelled by the love of Christ. Someone in our church passed away recently. And I got to do the funeral last week. I remember showing up there, and I missed all the Bible college notes that they teach you to do, is to be, an unhurried presence, to kind of read the room, engage, serve the family as best you can. So I got there on time, and I'm meeting with the family at the side, and my mind is scattered. There's other things going on, and I probably missed some of those notes as a pastor. And I remember this now widow, who's probably going through the darkest day of her life, in light of all that, comes over to me, the one who's supposed to serve her, and just says, "You doing okay? Is there anything I can do for you?" And I think that's what that looks like, is to be so controlled and compelled by the love of Christ that there's part of you that's just always towards others in who you are. It's when you see the love of Jesus, not as something to admire, but to be consumed by, to be controlled by. The cross is not this place of interest to discuss and deliberate. It's an event that disrupts everything. Everything, and a world that is centered around you begins to crumble. That is what the love of Jesus does in us. So I want to pray to that end. Father, there's this beautiful relationship to how we posture ourselves towards you. That we are to have reverence for you, to not want to misstep. But we also recognize your love for us is abundant, is overflowing. Your mercy and goodness is never ending. So Lord, I pray that for those who need to have greater reverence for you would have a moment of understanding the God of the cosmos, who gives every breath to all his creation, sustains all life, is the author of everything, the king over everything. This is who we converse with. I pray that propel us towards holiness. And for those who just feel inadequate, feel their shortcomings are their identity, Lord, I pray the love of you be profound in this moment. The love that comes from you would be consuming, would control us, not only individually, but as a church. Everything we do, everything we're about, would be controlled by the love of Christ. We pray this in your name. Amen.